Rips it to the end zone. Caught. Touchdown. Marvin Harrison Jr. making a huge impact.
Here's Edwards with the lay. Donovan Edwards down the sideline. Gets past Ransom. Donovan Edwards. Touchdown, Michigan.
Welcome into the CFF Sites preseason preview series, where today we're looking at the Big 12. My name is Joe DeSalvo. I am joined by my partner, Mike. Mike, here we are, second conference of the Power Fives, Big 12. After this show, we're 70% through and almost halfway through the Power Five conferences. As we get into the Big 12, it's a new look Big 12 this year with new teams joining the conference. Any thoughts on that before we get started and talk about the teams?
Yeah, I mean, it should be interesting, with the new schools coming in. I had a thought today. They actually released the media Big 12, all Big 12 team, and Jalen Daniels, who we'll get to in a bit, was named the offense or predicted to be the offensive player of the year. And I was like, we like him. But is the talent down in the Big 12 this year if Jalen Daniels is predicted to be the offensive player of the year? So that was just kind of a thought that I had when that was released today. So we'll dive into the teams and see what we like.
Yeah, I think before we get into the teams, just to build off of that thought, I think when you run down the list of the top names in the conference, right, you don't have a Bijan Robinson there this year. When you look at some of the top names on the list of all the teams, there's really nothing that stands out from returning top talent, even with the new teams that are joining the conference, where Jalen Daniels feels like the safe name. But I think, and maybe you're feeling too, my feeling is there's a couple of names out there that probably or could have or have potential to have a much bigger year. But maybe they're just a little more, they're a little less proven than Daniels right now. So that's maybe why he's kind of getting that call, getting the vote right now.
I think that's a perfect way to say it, that there's top tier college fantasy systems in this conference, but the players that are, in player battles to win those jobs, kind of uncertain and cloudy at the moment. So we'll dive into it.
Well, look, let's jump into one because, let's start off with Baylor, right? Because I think you and I would both agree there's potential for a guy in there to have a really big year. Richard Reese last year had a really big year at Baylor, and given his size, there's some debate on whether or not he can really duplicate those numbers. Well, Craig Williams transferred out of there. Dominic Richardson from Oklahoma State transferred in. A little bit of a concern there. My thought is, building off of what he did as a freshman last year, there's no reason for me to think that Richard Reese can't duplicate his numbers from last year. Where do you stand on that?
Depends if Dave Aranda wants to give him those carries. Do you remember that happened last year? I know DFS players were pissed when, Richard Reese had those back-to-back 30 carry games. And then, there was comments made by Aranda that maybe he could see less work in that time and that 3-game stretch that he had. And lo and behold, he had like 4 carries for minimal yardage. So, I think we would both agree that we really like Richard Reese as a running back prospect. It's a matter of if the coaching staff is going to allow him to get the carries necessary to be that 1,000-yard back that we've typically seen from Jeff Grimes, the offensive coordinator for Baylor. Increased depth with Dom Richardson transferring in, but he was awful last year for Oklahoma State. You can attribute that some to the offensive line, but he was really bad. Like you look at the metrics, and he was not as good as Jalen Nixon at Oklahoma State, not as good as even Ollie Gordon too. So maybe he fits the system better. So that's kind of the hesitation. They have bigger backs behind him. Dom Richardson, you like Quaylon Jones, who played well in spurts last year. So I think he's the best running back in the room. You would agree with that, but there's depth, coaching, if they allow him to get 20 carries a game.
Well, look, he's 5'9", 175, very similar in stature to another running back that was in the Big 12 last year, right, over at Kansas State. So, he's got 3 inches of height as well. But, Reese scored 14, we're talking, about Deuce Vaughn, right? Last year, he averaged 15 carries per game, Mike, at 5'9", 175, scored 14 touchdowns last year. So, like to your point, it really doesn't come down to whether or not they're going to give him the touches. It's can he consistently get those 14, 15 touches a game? And if he does, then last year would suggest. And look, Baylor didn't exactly tear it up last year, right? So I would think that he could be on par for some similar type numbers this year. I actually think I may be undervaluing him a little bit. I can't remember. It was one of the best ball drafts we just had where Richard Reese was still up on the board in the late teens. I think it was. And to, our surprise, we were like, look, we got to get ready and jump on this guy. I think somebody might have taken him, but maybe a little undervalued right now. I think his upside is tremendous.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think you made a good point or kind of insinuated the point that he might be a better best ball pick than, than in redraft this year, just because of kind of what we spoke about. Like if they're he's going to have blow up games, right? Just as he did last year, but maybe there's a game where Dom Richardson gets 10 to 15 carries and dips into that workload. So I think now thinking it through, he might be a better best ball candidate than redrafting. You just might have to deal with the ebbs and flows of the redraft season with Reese.
Yeah, from a receiver standpoint, Mike, Monterey Baldwin led the team in receptions, receiving yards last year. They had 4 receivers catch at least 3 touchdown passes, 3 caught 4. That was the team high for an individual player last year. Anything from the passing game we're looking at from fantasy, Monterey Baldwin, they brought in Keatron Jackson from Arkansas. Any name really jumping out at you for fantasy right now for drafts?
Not really. And maybe similar to Reese in that Monterey Baldwin would be a late round best ball candidate. Yeah. It's a talented room. I really like Keatron Jackson. Monterey Baldwin's arguably one of the fastest, if not the fastest player in the country. The quarterback play stinks. It was awful last year. I kind of did like Blake Shapen coming in. That was obviously wrong. So it's a talented wide receiver room, but I'm not confident that the quarterback can get them the ball on a consistent basis.
Well, look, that's going to be the question when we get over to BYU, which is where we'll hop over. Quarterback play. Kedon Slovis comes in, transfers over from Pitt, looking to take over that quarterback job. They bring in Aiden Robbins, the running back from UNLV. Let's spend a few minutes talking about BYU right now. I know for me, no interest in, Kedon Slovis from a quarterback position, but his effectiveness and his ability to be, keep that offense efficient really does affect some other fantasy assets on that offense, particularly Aiden Robbins. And is there another Puka Nacua on that roster this year in the passing game, right? I think that's the real question that many fantasy owners are going to be asking themselves.
I would say no, in terms of the wide receiver play. And if there's another Puka Nacua, the targets were really spread out last year with the BYU receivers. And I think with regards to Nacua, like he averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game, but he also had 5 rushing touchdowns. Like I think they tailored the offense to feature him in that role, not necessarily this system likes to get their wide receivers on jet sweeps or anything like that. I think that was tailored specifically to Nacua. So, I was reading up on the BYU receivers. Maybe you disagree, but I think they have a lot of solid, maybe wide receiver 2s. Cody Epps, really, solid. Chase Roberts. They brought in Darius Lassiter from Eastern Michigan. I think it's a really solid group, but there's not going to be a standout amongst that foursome. And I kind of similar to Blake Shapen, I'm not confident at all, as much as the coaching staff, as you've seen, wants to kind of hype up Kedon Slovis this offseason. I can't do it, especially now in the Big 12 too.
Yeah, I think Cody Epps is probably the more interesting name of the receiving core. He played 8 games last year, 39 receptions, 459, 6 touchdowns, average 4.9 yards, 4.9 receptions per game. So, I mean, from an upside standpoint, project that out to 12 games, no Puka Nacua this year. That looks interesting. And I think the other name, too, to kind of keep an eye on is Keanu Hill, just because he's a big target, 6'4", 215, caught 36 passes last year, 7 touchdowns. So he caught a touchdown pass, 1 every 5 receptions, right? So you look at him as more of a red zone target. And, of course, you've got Isaac Rex coming back at tight end, too. So it feels like they have a really good duo when it comes to, red zone threats. But to the point that I made earlier when we brought up BYU, Ken Slovis, how will he be? Can he be effective, and will the offense be efficient so they're getting those red zone opportunities?
Yeah, as much as I want to, poo-poo Keaton Slovis, like I think he is serviceable enough to to get this offense into scoring range and scoring opportunities. Yep. We like the surrounding talent around him, but he's not going to be a fantasy asset. I don't know. I haven't drafted any of the wide receivers. I think it's a solid group that's just going to average probably 10 to 12 fantasy points per game in between, the top 2 or 3. How do you feel about Aiden Robbins? Because I went on a podcast on Chasing the Natty, and I really couldn't even I didn't even have a talking point about Aiden Robbins. Well, look, I don't have a strong opinion either way.
You know what? I think the same applies. You're looking at a 6'3", 230 running back that carried the ball over 200 times in 11 games last year, went over 1,000 yards, had 9 touchdowns at UNLV. I think given the history of that BYU offense, I think that's the player we might be undervaluing a little bit, that maybe has the higher upside if he's going to get the lion's share of carries. I think he's got 1,000-yard double-digit touchdown potential in this offense. But to the point that I made before, this offense is going to have to be effective. It's going to have to be efficient, and they're going to have to find ways to get red zone opportunities, or, they're going to go belly up in their first year in the Big 12. But you know what? BYU plays a tough schedule every year. I don't think they're going to be fazed by a Big 12 schedule. As a matter of fact, I think they're going to do better than most people think they will. But it all comes down to quarterback play for me. To me, this offense is really going to come down to how well Keaton Slovis can be moving this offense with efficiency up and down the field. And I do think that's going to dictate what we see from a fantasy standpoint. And I don't think Slovis is going to be a fantasy asset myself, but I do think his ability to move the offense will affect the assets such as Robbins and Hill and the Epps and Isaac Rex.
Sure. Just a closing point on Robbins for me. They are losing multiple starters along the offensive line, and some of the returnees are even changing positions too along the offensive line. So I think there could be some adjustment period there. I did look up one stat mildly interesting with Robbins. Among running backs last year with at least 100 carries, he ranked 50th in yards per carry after contact. That was tied at 3.37 yards. That was tied with Will Shipley. So just to put some context around how good and solid Aiden Robbins was last year.
And also another point, I remember you and I talking about this with him as his freshman year, his true freshman year, he played in 7 games, right? And that 2020 year technically didn't count. That was the COVID season. In 2021, he only played in 4 games. So he could have redshirted that year, which made 2022 his redshirt freshman year. So technically, if he wanted to play, he's got 3 years to play at BYU. Now, if he's any good, I doubt he stays around that long. But technically, based on the NCAA, rules, he's only a redshirt sophomore this year. So that's just something to think about as well.
Yeah, I try not to boggle my mind with the years of eligibility with players.
Well, look, we're talking about BYU, and you were talking about turnover at the offensive line, but aren't they going to bring back 7 guys that have been on missions for a couple of years, and they're going to be 25, 26 years old anyway? These are men coming back, so we're good, man.
Men, married, kids, everything.
Yeah. There we go. They're already uncles. Hey, look, here we go. Cincinnati, another team, new addition into the Big 12. Scott Satterfield now takes over the program at Louisville last year. brings in Emory Jones. Remember,
I was going to say, do you want to start this one and profess your love to Emory Jones?
I was high on, I mean, Emory Jones was the guy that I was high on 2 years ago, went belly up over at Florida. But did Satterfield find the right guy bringing in Emory Jones? Like, man, it just really, really makes me wonder. There's a lot of questions in this offense, but to your point that you made at the beginning of the show, this is an offense that has built some good fantasy assets under Satterfield, and we've got Emory Jones at quarterback and at running back, possibly Corey Kiner, who we really haven't, we've kind of waited. We thought maybe last year he'd break out, and we're not confident he's even going to be this year. But this is the offense that is made for a breakout type season.
Yes and no. Yes, in terms of like the longevity, the track record longevity of running back one under Satterfield. Yes, right. That sets up perfectly for Corey Kiner. What doesn't? Replacing 4 starters along the offensive line. They still, I think, return the majority of their rushing production from last year, so they're bringing back most everybody in that backfield. Yeah. And I didn't look at it too closely today, but I also saw, I think they're projected by one site at like 3.5 wins this season. So how much are they going to be running the ball if they're going, if they're going to be underdogs in most contests this year? So, I kind of like Corey Kiner as a buy low candidate, maybe a bounce back year, but there's things that I just mentioned that are working against him, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Luke Fickell leaving Cincinnati to go to Wisconsin has probably left the cupboard a little bare. And for a program that has, lately been pretty good over the last few years, you just kind of get the feeling with Fickell out and Satterfield coming in, he's going to take a couple of years to get his feet underneath him over there.
No doubt. I've drafted Emory Jones though too. It's a running quarterback, right? And maybe he throws 12 touchdowns this season, but this is a guy that ran for, I think, 700 yards 2 years ago in the SEC. You'll take that all day from a CFF quarterback. So, I kind of like Emory Jones beyond round, 20, 25 as a, QB4 on your roster. Corey Kiner, kind of same range, but that's, I think, the extent of our interest in Cincinnati.
Yeah, see, for me, Corey Kiner's more of a traditional fantasy draft pick, in my opinion. If it works out, great. If not, you drop him and you move on. I've been staying away from him in best ball drafts.
Just to close them out, too, one player that's, I'm sure other sites are aware of this player, but I looked a little bit at their incoming freshman, Brady Drogosh, I believe is how it's pronounced. Emory Jones probably going to be gone after this year. I'm sure his eligibility runs out. Evan Prater, who should be the backup this year, I think we saw last year in the bowl game that he's just not the guy at this point. So incoming freshman, I believe he put on 20 some pounds already since he's been on campus in January. Fits that kind of Satterfield dual threat quarterback. So he should have a clear path after this season to step into that role. We figure Cincinnati's going to be better in the years to come under Satterfield. So he's a guy that I would definitely invest in dynasty formats.
Sounds good. Let's go to another new kid on the block, and that's Houston, going alphabetically, Mike, where Houston, they didn't lose a coach, but they lost a lot of talent. They lost Clayton Tune. They lost their offensive coordinator over to Miami. Nathaniel Dell, one of the best, if not the best fantasy receiver in the country last year. They did go out and bring in Donovan Smith from Texas Tech, who is still competing to get the starting job. I think we're under the assumption that Matthew Golden is going to slide into that wide receiver 1 spot for the Cougars, who they're deep at receiver, right? And I think it would be a little silly to think that Golden's going to step in and produce Nathaniel Dell type numbers, but we do have him projected at wide receiver 1. I do like him a lot this year. Particularly if they just identify that quarterback and they get the offense rolling this year under Donovan Smith, or I believe it's going to be Donovan Smith, but who knows? What's your thoughts on the Houston offense? Remember, Alton McCaskill transferred out of there too. We thought they'd get him back this year. He went over to Colorado. So new look offense for Houston in a new look conference this year.
Yeah, I think they could struggle from a potentially a win-loss perspective. But I mean, this is a Dana Holgorsen team, right? Like, I was looking back, the lowest fantasy output from a Dana Holgorsen quarterback was Clint Trickett, back at West Virginia, and he still threw for 3,200 yards and averaged 20 fantasy points per game. That is your absolute floor, and he was a non-runner, right? So, I think we would agree that Donovan Smith's probably not going to put up Clayton Tune-like numbers this year, but just the proven production from a fantasy quarterback under Holgorsen. I really like Smith this year as a top 30 quarterback. And you spoke to it. I mean, they've got Matthew Golden, I believe, will be wide receiver one. You said it. He's not going to put up Nathaniel Dell type numbers, but because of the depth at receiver, and I think that just helps out the entire offense as a whole. Stephon Johnson comes in from Oklahoma State. Sam Brown produced at a high level at points last year. They have depth at receiver that I think that will help this offense translate into the Big 12.
Yeah, and I think one thing to keep an eye on, when you look at running back, you had Tony Mathis Jr. transfer in from West Virginia. You've got Stacey Sneed still back, even though they lost Alton McCaskill, right? But the one thing to keep in mind, Donovan Smith scored 7 rushing touchdowns at Texas Tech last year. So he does give you that dual threat ability and that bigger body around the goal line this year. So it wouldn't even surprise me if he becomes more of their leading scorer, touchdown scorer this year. When it comes to running the football, when they get the ball inside the 5.
Yeah, this is, again, I look back at West Virginia when that offense was really humming, and Skylar Howard, who is not the athlete that Donovan Smith is, had 463 yards and 10 rushing touchdowns. So I mean, that's kind of the upside that you get with a dual threat like Donovan Smith in this style of offense.
Yep. Now, let's go over to Iowa State, because this is a team that we've had a couple of different discussions for different reasons this year. First of all, let's start with the obvious. They lose Xavier Hutchinson. I mean, you're looking at 100+ target position there that's now vacated. I think we have Jalen Noel in there projected at wide receiver 1. So the question is, will he see the targets that Hutchinson has seen the last couple of years in this Iowa State offense, given the fact that Nate Scheelhaus, who was the run game coordinator last year, has now been promoted to offensive coordinator. So is that good or bad for the offense when it comes to throwing the ball, running the ball? And Hunter Deckers is back, and a player that I was very high on in the spring, and so much so that I told you I was ready to take him in all my drafts, given Matt Campbell's history of running back, running back Jarrell Brock. Now, I say all of that to say this. I have, there's a bunch of us out there. It's not a secret anymore, but there's rumors and whispers of a gambling scandal that's gone on from Iowa to Iowa State. There are a few other programs that might be involved as well, but we don't have any names. But there are rumors out there circulating that Hunter Deckers and Jarrell Brock are 2 names that are supposedly caught up in this thing, which could lead to possible suspensions of them missing, up to a game, 6 games, and maybe even possibly a year. And no one knows right now what the heck is going on. So that has tempered my expectations on Jarrell Brock, and I was ready to push all my chips in on the table on this guy in every draft. As you saw in the best ball draft, the first one we did, I drafted him, and I stayed away in the second draft just because I'm afraid to lose a best ball position. But in traditional drafts right now, I'd probably still go all in on him until we get some sort of official word. Where do you stand on Iowa State players right now, given all this going on?
I mean, I haven't drafted really anybody except for now Cartavius Norton late in drafts. It's funny. I think these rumors might have saved you some money in our best ball drafts by avoiding Jarrell Brock now. So yeah, I mean, they're just rumors at this point. If I understand it correctly, and I'll probably be corrected by one of our listeners, I was looking at it. I think 30% of the season is what they would potentially be looking at here. So if it comes to light that it's these players that we're discussing, I don't think they would miss the entirety of the season, but that just it removes them from my queue because they weren't even high priority targets, at least for me, Hunter Dekkers, Jarrell Brock. So, I like Cartavius Norton now more in the later rounds. I do think, their offensive line was terrible, but they're getting the majority of the players back. They've made some additions, some coaching changes that I think they know that offensive line needs to be fixed. And we've talked about it. We're both hopeful that it is fixed because Matt Campbell, RB1, was just a staple of college fantasy. That's lock it in, top 10 fantasy position every single year. So we're hopeful that we get back to that. At receiver, we have Jalen Noel right now as the top target getter. And I am still relatively confident right now that he would be the top target getter, but there is some prior history that goes along with this. I think 7 of the last 8 Matt Campbell wide receiver ones have been outside receivers. And that's in terms of not necessarily targets, but from a fantasy points per game aspect. So typically it's been the outside receiver. They do have a FCS transfer that made waves in the spring, Jaden Higgins, 6'4" guy. And I don't know. I kind of like it because he's that bigger bodied receiver that is probably going to be more sought after by Dekkers or whoever the QB is in the red zone. Noel is I feel confident he's going to get the majority of the targets, but he averaged 8.5 yards per catch last year, 8 out of 6.5. Everything is right around the line or within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. So Jaden Higgins, another receiver to kind of put on your radar.
Yeah, I just wanted to finish the point on Jarrell Brock. I just, looking back last year, he went for 70 plus the first 4 games, back-to-back 100-yard games to start the year. One of those was against Iowa, 2 touchdowns in the first 4 games. He got dinged up and hurt and kind of as his season tanked after that. But I just feel that he's ready for a bounce back year. I feel if this whole gambling thing goes away, I feel Jarrell Brock is one of those players that could be my Mo Ibrahim from last year. We'll see. And I hope I'm wrong about the whole gambling situation, but it really does kind of turn me off right now in best ball formats. But in traditional, I'd take a stab because if he is suspended, like I said, you drop him, you move on, or maybe even draft him and Norton right now. And if the suspension goes through, you've got Norton. And if not, maybe you've got, Jarrell Brock. So I just wanted to finish the thought on that. Really, it depends on formats right now on which way I'm going.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think we're all ready to get that Matt Campbell running back 1 back in our college fantasy lives.
Well, let's go over to Kansas, Mike, because you brought up Jalen Daniels' name at the beginning of the show. Look, I think Kansas is going to be pretty good in the conference. Whether or not they'll contend for the title, that's going to be debatable. But they've got some decent names. Jalen Daniel at quarterback. You got Devin Neal back. You got Hishaw back at running back behind him. Lawrence Arnold at receiver, Luke Grimm, Mason Fairchild at tight end, Mike. But I think the big question, when it comes to Kansas is not necessarily Jalen Daniels. I think what you see is what you get. We have him projected. I believe we're projecting him a top 20 quarterback. So we feel pretty comfortable with that. The bigger question comes in at running back. Is Devin Neal going to be a workhorse back, or will we see more of a split in this Kansas backfield? That's my biggest question. That's why I haven't been all over Devin Neal yet, because I'm not comfortable he is going to be that guy that's going to get most of the work in that backfield. And I'm concerned that there will be a split backfield.
Yeah, I would agree with you. He was only averaging 11 carries per game within the first 8 weeks of last season. And then the only reason he had those 2 blow-up games back to back was because there was injuries in the backfield to Daniel Hishaw and then Sevion Morrison, I believe. Both of those players were injured at the time. So assuming everybody's healthy, and they added Kai Thomas to that backfield too now. So they have 4 capable-ish running backs, or 3 behind Devin Neal. I kind of see a split backfield. I have maybe 1 share in the 30 some drafts that I've done this offseason of Devin Neal. I just think that they're going to split it up. And, people want to compare it to, or people want to talk about, it's a Lance Leipold running back one. Well, they're throwing it more now than they did back at Buffalo. So not only are they throwing it more, but you have more propensity of a split backfield. And that's kind of a stay away for me. But, he falls to you in the, double digit teen rounds. I'll take a shot. Fine. He's a really talented player and a good offense that you mentioned.
You also have Jalen Daniels as a running threat too, to punch the ball in the end zone. So that kind of eats into some of the red zone appeal for Neal too, right?
And Jason Bean.
Yeah,
Jason Bean potentially. Sure. They were working him in some packages in the spring. That's just more mouths to feed.
Yep, absolutely. Anything from the receiver standpoint that we should kind of be putting our fingers on the watch? I know Mason Fairchild, for me, decent fantasy option if you're playing in the tight end only league. I don't think you can do worse than him at tight end. We've got him projected, I think, in the top 20, 25 tight ends or so. Anything else from the passing game stand out to you?
Not receiver. It's a good group, but they just spread it out too much. I do like Fairchild a little bit. I'm not going to prioritize him as a top 10 tight end, but 37 of his 43 targets last season came in the last 8 games. So they started targeting him more as the season went along. So I think he might actually be my most owned Kansas player at this point. So he's a guy I like as your tight end 2 on a roster.
Now let's go over to Kansas State, Mike. From Kansas to Kansas State, Will Howard comes back at quarterback, but with Deuce Vaughn heading out, they bring in Trayshawn Ward from Florida State. We've got DJ Giddens, a bigger back there as well. 1-2 punch for Kansas State. It's Kansas State. We're going to start and kind of end with the running game. So let's go ahead and kind of jump into it. I'll let you go first because I know where I stand on this one. I think you know where I stand.
I actually think we agree on this.
Okay.
All 5 starters back on the offensive line. So it's going to be a really, really, really good running game. What makes it tough, and we had this discussion when doing the projections, is this coaching staff, Chris Kleiman and now offensive coordinator, what the heck is his name? The former quarterback for Kansas State, Colin Klein.
Fine. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you look back at Chris Kleiman and his time at Kansas State and then back at North Dakota State, you have both sides of the coin. He gave one of his North Dakota State running backs 300 carries. And we saw that last year with Deuce Vaughn. But then you look in some of those prior years before Deuce Vaughn, they're splitting it up all over the place, right? It's a split backfield. They're getting the quarterback involved in the running game too. So you have evidence of both. I did like Trayshawn Ward more back in March than I do now, just because you look at some of the projected depth charts, you see DJ Giddens atop the depth chart. And I think he's a good player too. So I think we would agree, and you can expand on this, that we're going to see more of a split this year between Trayshawn Ward and DJ Giddens.
Yeah. Here's the thing with, the one thing with Kansas State quarterbacks we saw last year with Adrian Martinez is that you worry too about the quarterback dipping into those rushing numbers. I don't think we're going to really have to worry about that much with Will Howard this year. I think they're going to have to make sure that he stays healthy. I know he got banged up a little bit during the season. You and I, we were discussing this all spring long. They bring in Ward. I really like Giddens. I liked what he did last year. I think he can be a very impactful player. And I think the projections takes on where we kind of landed with this, right? I think Ward, we can see almost Ward and Giddens almost, splitting, or even if it's 60-40 Ward when it comes to carries. But the potential for those short yardage goal line carries does swing the pendulum a little bit over to Giddens. And then if you're looking for somebody in one of those backs to assume the receptions out of the backfield that Vaughn had, which he caught 40-plus passes last year, you swing the pendulum a little bit back to Ward, right? And so what it comes down to and where we landed is we might actually see 2 really relevant, and I think we're expecting 2 really relevant fantasy running backs where I think we're landing on Ward being more of the yardage PPR guy and Giddens still being consistent carries, consistent work, and maybe finding those 6 pointers for you more than Ward. I think that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I agree. I think again, all five starters back on the offensive line. So I think this running game should not take a step back whatsoever. I'm still working out how I want to attack this situation personally, and I think it's just stack it, right? Get Ward and Giddens just because it's we expect it to be that good of a rushing offense. I will disagree with you on one point, and I've changed my tune a little bit. I look back and Will Howard had 364 yards and 78 carries as a freshman. So he has that ability to run. He just didn't, I don't think he showed it as much last year just with the injury to AJ Martinez and wanting to keep him healthy. So he has that in his bag. And this is an offense, going back to their offensive coordinator and Colin Klein, they run their quarterbacks, right? So I think there's potential that he could maybe get 100 or so carries this year as well.
Yeah, he could. I mean, look, that offense is gonna, they're gonna run it a ton, right? I mean, there's enough balls to go around to make all three of those relevant for sure. Anything in the passing game stand out to you?
It's very similar to the Kansas who we just spoke about.
I agree.
Wide receivers, decent group, but they're gonna split it around a bit. Tight end Ben Senat, all four of his receiving touchdowns last year came with Will Howard at quarterback. Yes. So that's very interesting from that standpoint. I haven't drafted him a ton, but he could easily be a top 15 option this year at tight end.
Yeah, all four of those TDs came in the last 4 regular season games of the year too. So you just wonder if he becomes a little bit more of a consistent piece in that offense, and maybe you're looking at him being having more of a fantasy impact than maybe we even have projected right now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
What about over Oklahoma, Mike? They bring Dillon Gabriel back now for another year. He announced that he was coming back. But when you look at the rest of the offense, I think, value there is in wide receiver 1. We've got Jaleel Farouk projected in that spot right now. The real question right now for fantasy owners is more so at that running back spot. I can't, maybe we spoke on it on another show. I know you and I have had discussions about it, but Javante Barnes, I think, missed a portion of spring. He had a little bit of a foot issue that's, I think, maybe really just a chronic and lingering issue since his high school years. That's concerning because you've got Gavin Sawchuk there waiting in the wings. You've even got a Marcus Major. There's quality depth behind Barnes if he's not ready to roll. And if he is, are we looking at more of a split backfield? Because there's a lot of folks that are high on Sawchuk.
Yeah, I think it's just partially it's the lasting impression that he gave us in that bowl game against Florida State, where he ran for 100 yards and a touchdown and looked really good doing it. So, I've been drafting Gavin Sawchuk, especially once we heard that news with Javante Barnes. It just, I don't know. You spoke on it, kind of a lingering issue potentially that, just some cloudiness around that I think he should. We'll see with fall camp. I think he should be ready to go for the regular season, but just, anytime there's a murky situation like that, especially when you have a talented perceived backup like Gavin Sawchuk, like I'm going to start taking him in drafts, especially when he was going beyond rounds 20. So, I like Sawchuk. They're going to split it around again. It's going to be a run heavy offense for Oklahoma because, let's be honest, they have one option, like legitimate option now at receiver. And Dillon Gabriel was fine last year. Averaged 27 fantasy points per game, but I don't see much upside beyond that just because of, the limited options in the passing game. So I like the backfield. Sawchuk's probably my favorite Oklahoma player to draft this year. Where do you stand on them?
Interesting because the best ball formats and it's the same reason I mentioned this when it comes to Jarrell Brock. And that is, I just feel that in a best ball format, when there are no in-season acquisitions, every roster spot is precious. You need a guy that you almost feel is going to play every week just to contribute to that best ball format. When I look at it and I think if I'm going Barnes, you have to handcuff him with Sawcheck. And when you start getting into handcuff situations, depending on who you've gotten at running back before Barnes, you're now possibly, if that plays out the way that we're talking and there is a lingering issue, you're down now a roster spot. So I like Barnes more so in a traditional format, and I would still handcuff him with Sawcheck, because 1 or 2 games you can let one of those guys go if you feel like one of them is going to get the lion's share of carries. The best ball format, it just scares me because I feel like every position is precious. Now, we play in the best balls we play 26 rounds, right? If it was more of a 40 rounder, then I'd feel a hell of a lot more comfortable handcuffing guys. But it all depends on the format of your league and the roster size. But that sort of gives you some idea of where my head kind of goes when I'm thinking of this running back situation or any running back situation when we're talking about handcuffs.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'd be curious if, we talk about Jeff Lebby, their offensive coordinator for Oklahoma. And, we always talk about, he loves to split it up, right? He's traditionally, even going back to Ole Miss and UCF, traditionally split it between, the top 2 and 3 backs. Well, Eric Gray had 200 plus carries last year. I think that speaks to what I said with Oklahoma running the ball last year more than they traditionally do under Jeff Lebby. So, I think it is, I get your point of, hey, I feel more comfortable about stacking, if you're getting a 35 round draft, 40 round draft, but I think they're going to be running the football enough to where I think I feel comfortable in a 25, 26 round draft to stack that room.
Okay. It's all good. What about Oklahoma State now? Because we're going to almost get, we've got a lot of some similarities in the Oklahoma State backfield right now. We've got Ollie Gordon projected at running back 1. I don't know if we're 100% rock solid, steady that is going to be the case, but all signs are pointing towards that. But he right now, is the top option at running back. You've got a quarterback situation where Alan Bowman, is he your starting quarterback? Is it Garrett Rangel? There's some questions there. And then look, Mike, as well as I, that wide receiver 1 spot in that offense has been the guy to target. Is it going to be Jaden Bray? Is it going to be the Washington State transfer Dazon Stribling? Or should guys just play it safe and go with Brennan Presley, who's just been kind of that steady guy? I'm just throwing it out there, right? So give me your thoughts on the Oklahoma State offense right now.
Real quick, I'll just hit on receiver. So, yes, Brennan Presley, it was the first time in a decade, I think, that the slot receiver finished as the wide receiver 1 last year on a fantasy points per game basis under Mike Gundy. But you saw it. He averaged, I think, 11, 12 fantasy points per game. It's the limited upside, right? Maybe he leads the team in targets again, but it's not going to be worth it to have him on a roster. I would rather take a shot on Jaden Bray or Stribling very late in drafts. But, they really spread it around last year because they didn't have a dominant guy. I have 4 more receivers had 14% target share. So I'm not entirely too confident that Alan Bowman, the former 4th string quarterback for Michigan, can support any wide receiver in this offense. So maybe a shot late, but that's the extent of it for that. Where I'll let you start first. Yep. Where are you on the running back here with Ollie Gordon? Because as you know, the running back 1 under Mike Gundy has been very, very good at times in the past.
Yeah, I like Ollie Gordon. He's my running back 1. But like I said, it really depends on the format right now. I'm not jumping headfirst into the pool as if it's filled with water right now. And look, that's what's the interesting thing about college fantasy football. And that is we tend to put a little bit more stock in the security of knowing what we have and which programs are returning what players, and that's why the proven players always go first in these formats. these are the guys that sometimes can make a roster. You hit on an Ollie Gordon, or you hit on that wide receiver one for Oklahoma State, and all of a sudden now, you're operating with a better hand than everybody else that you drafted against. I do like Ollie Gordon at wide receiver one, and right now, Jaden Bray underperformed last year. Of course, he was hurt, right? We had him projecting at wide receiver one going into the year. When I look at Dazon Stribling, they bring him in from Washington State, where he was their top receiver. For me, when you bring in a receiver like that, I think you're bringing him in to be wide receiver one. And I'm on the Stribling island right now of wide receiver one at Oklahoma State as well. So those are the two. But to your point, who the heck is throwing the ball at Oklahoma State, and can they deliver that nice deep ball or get the ball into the hands with consistency to whoever is going to be that wide receiver one? Does that make Gordon a little bit more of a safer option and give him more upside? It does, as long as that we know that he's the guy. But yes, long-winded answer, I'm on the Ollie Gordon train right now. I'm just not on him being a top 15 running back right now, which we know that this offense under Gundy has potential to boost a running back stock when that guy is in that spot.
Yeah, it's a jumbled track record of, you can get they've had top 5 running backs, and then you can get a guy that fails to get, 500-600 yards in a season. So, yeah, I like him better in a redraft probably than best ball, just because if it doesn't pan out, you can just cut him during the season. I think my hesitation with Ollie Gordon is, you brought in Elijah Collins, the Michigan State transfer. You attempted to bring in Sean Tyler, who was committed at one point from Western Michigan. Obviously, he ended up at Minnesota. But if you're confident as a coaching staff in Ollie Gordon, I don't feel like you bring in two transfers in Sean Tyler and Elijah Collins. I did find an interesting stat. Bear with me while I tried to read it here on Elijah Collins. So Elijah Collins, formerly of Michigan State, had 70 carries last year for the Spartans. 27.5% of those carries came in the red zone. That is the highest mark of any single running back coming back this season who attempted at least 50 carries. So maybe does Gundy see that kind of role for Elijah Collins, maybe in inside the red zone, and could that some of those touchdowns go to him as opposed to Ollie Gordon? I just thought that was kind of interesting, kind of speaks to the point that, hey, you attempted to bring in multiple transfers during the offseason. If you were sold on Ollie Gordon, why would you do that? And then final point that I wanted to make, do you remember a couple of years ago when Jaylen Warren won the starting job out of the blue at Oklahoma State? I don't know, weird stuff happens with the Cowboys in this roster. Mike Gundy does weird things. So, would you be totally surprised to see Elijah Collins or somebody else win that starting job?
No, I wouldn't. And
I wouldn't.
That's why, and I think I think this is why I say, and you and I talk about this all the time. There are certain players that I see that have a good upside, but their upside to me isn't so far up there that I can't see another player that's safer at their position. I'd rather take that safer player who I also feel has a higher floor. And so when I look at Ollie Gordon, I see a guy that has a high ceiling, but I also see a guy that has a really low floor too, based on the situation that you just mentioned. And I tend to lean with a little bit more of a safer option, higher upside. Give me the higher floor player in some instances, because if I'm going after Ollie Gordon, chances are I've already got 2 or 3 running backs on my roster, right? So, that in the best ball formats, that's just my thought. And then just to finish off, another point that you were making, Spencer Sanders is no longer there either, right? So does that open up to a few more carries for the running backs in a situation where now Spencer Sanders is gone? So
yeah, you would think Alan Bowman ain't running it. We know that for sure.
That's a fact. So, well, look, Mike, let's go over to TCU. Max Duggan gone. Top running back, receiver, all gone, right? I mean, this is a new offensive coordinator. Went out to Clemson. So Kendall Briles comes in from Arkansas. So, we're wondering what kind of offense we're going to get here. But we know that we're going to probably see Chandler Morris at quarterback. When it comes to running back, you've got Trey Sanders there. You've got Amani Bailey there. I think there's some debate on whether that's still settled or whether that's settled at all at the running back spot. Receivers kind of wide open too. It seems like Savion Williams was kind of like the talk of maybe he'd be the wide receiver one when you look at spring training. And I put a ton of stock in quarterback receiver connections in spring training, which bodes well for John Paul Richardson's fantasy stock. They brought him over from Oklahoma State. He had a really good connection with Chandler Morris in the spring. I think I'm a lot higher on John Paul Richardson than most right now based on where I've drafted him and have him in my rankings based on where I've seen him when I've not drafted him. I'm also high on Trey Sanders right now at running back. I think he can win that job. He had a pretty good showing in the spring game as well. I'm not necessarily reaching for any of these guys, though. They've got to fall for me at good value, and that even includes quarterback Chandler Morris. Are you kind of on the same train right now with them?
Yeah, I think
or at least one or two of them.
I think you kind of put it perfectly at the end there that, if Trey Sanders starts to fall, if Chandler Morris starts to fall, if one of the receivers that I like starts to fall, like I will, draft them, right? Value.
Yeah. Briles offense. Yeah.
Briles offense, or Briles and Sonny Dykes offense.
Right.
Yeah. So like there's proven, these coaches are proven that they'll get the most out of the returning talent. I think the problem is with me saying that is that they don't have a lot of returning pieces. Brought in some intriguing pieces, John Paul Richardson, Trey Sanders, get back Chandler Morris this year. It's just a lot of roster turnover to where I'm not fully bought into going up to snag one of these guys. I think they're going to run the ball a little bit more than we've seen from in the past under Sonny Dykes. 8% on average. Kendall Briles' offense runs it more than Sonny Dykes. So I think we'll see, Trey Sanders and Amani Bailey, like you said, how they divvy it up. I'm not sure. If you look at Kendall Briles, I mean, he had Raheem Sanders, but then he's also had years where he's just completely spread it across the board.
Well, I was going to say that he had Raheem Sanders last year, and Kendra Miller is no longer at TCU, right? So I think you and I would both agree that as of right now, Sanders and Bailey are not on that level. And so we may get a little bit more of split workload. We may get one of those guys that are eventually going to get the majority of work, but I don't know if we're necessarily looking at a 200 carry guy in that backfield this year.
Probably not. I mean, Trey Sanders would be that guy,
right?
Former 5-star
and there is
talent.
Potential out of the catch, out of the backfield as a receiver. There's potential there as well.
Yeah, so he would be the upside guy, I think, between him and Amani Bailey. But I think they'll spread it around a little bit more in the backfield. I don't think they have a Quentin Johnson, in my opinion, in the wide receiver room.
No,
so I think
I would agree
they might
with you.
Spread it out a little bit more. I don't know. Chandler Morris would be the guy that I'm kind of interested in most, but other people just, they're going up to draft him before I am comfortable. So I think that it's going to be a little bit of a rebuilding year for the TCU offense.
So let's go over to Texas, Mike, where when I look at the names on paper, it's hard for me to think Texas doesn't have the best offense in the conference. You've got Quinn Ewers back at quarterback who, I think underperformed last year. I think if he's going to come good, he's got to make good this year. And look, they lose Bijan Robinson, but they've got a stable of backs, young talent, Baxter, Brooks. I mean, you go down the list, you could even add more to that. When you look at receiver, Xavier Worthy is back. They add in A.D. Mitchell from Georgia. You've got Jordan Whittington back. You've got Jatavian Sanders at the tight end spot. You've got Isaiah Nayer, who was at Wyoming and had a good year 2 years ago and missed all of last season because he suffered, I think it was a preseason injury. So when it comes to names on paper, Mike, the talent is there. Can they put it together, and who's going to be the names that we need to know are the biggest questions going into this year? Because for me right now, it's kind of Xavier Worthy, and everybody else has that potential right now. Where do you stand with the Texas offense?
Yeah, I have most shares of anybody. It would be Xavier Worthy,
Right.
and it's just a track record of a wide receiver one in Steve Sarkisian's offense. I thought Jared chasing the Natty had a really good stat for Xavier Worthy. He said 20% of his targets they connected. Oh boy, now I'm botching the stat, right? So they connected on 20% of his targets over 20 yards or more, just 20%, right? You increase, you double that, right? Maybe it gets to 30-40%, and just imagine on those targets, how much that could increase his production levels. So
That's a good point you bring up, because I remember, and it's a great stat to know, because I remember watching Texas quite a few times last year, and there were times where Worthy was open and he just could not get the ball. It was overthrown, badly thrown. And he also had a couple of bad drops last year too. You put those two things together, and you'd have looked at it, we would have seen a completely different season from Xavier Worthy last year.
Yeah, I did plenty of prop betting with Xavier Worthy last year, because he was always at like 60 yards. I'm like, my God, this guy can crush it with one
only
reception.
Needed one catch sometimes.
Yeah. And there is literally a dent on this desk right now for my head slamming against it, watching Xavier Worthy either drop the ball or Quinn Ewers overthrowing him. So I'm highest on Xavier Worthy. Quinn Ewers, I'm kind of out, but like he's fallen to a range in drafts to where, you consider taking him.
Yeah.
Jatavian Sanders, I'm just trying to hit on all the players for Texas right now. Jatavian Sanders, I think he's as good, maybe a step below Brock Bowers in terms of talent at tight end, but you listed off all the playmakers that
well,
Texas
my thought was, and I know that we talked this in the spring, is that you bring in Mitchell from Georgia, and now you've got it, because at Georgia, he was, a great red zone target. Now you bring him into the fold, and you wonder whether or not he kind of lessens the value of a Jatavian Sanders, or makes him a little less valuable in that red zone, because now Texas has another big body. That was a conversation I remember you and I were having in the projections. Does Mitchell coming in really negatively affect Sanders from a number standpoint, because now they've got another big body receiver to put in the red zone in there with Worthy, right? But to your point, we know he's talented. We know he did it last year. He's put up the numbers, right? There's a lot of names on the list. We haven't even gotten to running back yet.
Yeah. So I that's my hesitation with Jatavian Sanders. There's a lot of mouths to feed, and Quinn Ewers has to obviously be better to support all those playmakers at wide receiver and tight end. Running backs, very interesting. I surprisingly have zero best ball shares of Baxter or Jonathan Brooks, and I'm regretting it right now, because just look at the track record of Sarkisian and his running back one. We're hesitant on who we think is going to be that starter for the entirety of the season, right? Right now, Jonathan Brooks I would put a hefty sum that Jonathan Brooks is going to get the first carry of the season for Texas. It's a matter of who's getting that carry in week 12 and 13. So they return 95% of their offensive line snaps. That is a situation where you have to stack Brooks and Baxter. Yeah. And I think it's worth it too, because of how good that offensive line was last year and how much they bring back as well.
Yep. That's a great point. Let's go over to Texas Tech, Mike. Let's start at quarterback right there, because we've got two names that it seems like for the last year and this year, like if you're going to draft Tyler Shugg, you better have some shares of Baron Morton. I know last year I was on the kind of on the train of, I thought halfway through the year Baron Morton would take over as the starter, because I thought the Texas Tech schedule would be a little tough, and I thought Shugg would face some hurdles along the way. Lo and behold, he gets hurt, and it was Donovan Smith who got the call. Like, it was just a rotation, a quarterback carousel over there. But the way that Tyler Shugg carried that team down the stretch at the end of the year and into that bowl game, was that a glimpse of expectations for 2023? I lean more on the side of yes. And if so, then that takes care of quarterback. Let's get to receiver, where you've got Jaron Bradley there. You've got Miles Price there. And really the talk of the spring, at least early on, I know you were mentioning his name, was Dre McCray. What should fantasy owners be looking at or expecting, or what are you thinking about receiver right now at Texas Tech?
I've come around to Jaron Bradley as the solidified wide receiver one here. I think he's the safest option, though. He closed the season on a high note. 300 yards and 3 scores over the final month of the season. People talk about him. He's got the size, the speed. He's got the physical attributes that you want in a wide receiver one. My hesitation is the propensity to be the slot receiver in Zach Kidley's offense. So that's where I still am attracted to Miles Price. Dre McCray, he fits the mold of a slot receiver, but in the spring game, he shifted outside too. So I think Bradley's the safest play. A lot of depth at that wide receiver spot and talent. So I think Bradley's the safest play of the group, but I would not be shocked whatsoever to see if Miles Price or Dre McCray ends up as wide receiver one. I wouldn't be totally shocked by that.
Yeah, I'm actually, I think I really like Bradley. I'm in on him with having top 10 potential. I really like. I think a second year in this offense is going to be really good for him. And the good thing is, and I think this is something that's good for the Texas Tech receiver situation, unlike some of the others that we just mentioned, like at Oklahoma State. I don't think the quarterback's not going to matter in this situation. I think they've got 2 quarterbacks that can run this offense. And so one quarterback going down, I don't think will necessarily affect the receivers at all. I think it really just comes down to who do we know are going to be in that wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, and wide receiver 3 spots to start the year. Has the interest in Dre McCray cooled lately, Mike, in some of the drafts you've been in?
It depends on who's in it. Nicky and Allen, CFB winning edge, he takes them still very highly, top 10 rounds. So it depends on who's in the draft, but he's cooled from the start of spring. Let's just say that.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's go over to UCF, the last of the newest additions in the conference that we're going to mention. John Rice Plumlee coming back at quarterback. I think we've got him ranked as a top 10 fantasy quarterback based on that offense under Gus Malzahn. And I think rightly so. When he's good, he can put up the numbers in chunks because of that running ability that we talk about. At running back, Isaiah Bowser is out of there. R.J. Harvey right now projected running back 1 for us. You've got Javon Baker, Kobe Hudson, probably 2 receiver options. When it comes to this UCF offense, Mike, is it about the quarterback and RB1, or are there other players that we need to be paying attention to?
That's it for me. I was mildly interested in the receivers, but Corey Gamage, formerly of Marshall, was committed to Purdue. He's now transferring to UCF. So that's a very crowded room in an offense that wants to run the ball first and foremost. So I'm out on the receivers there. RJ Harvey, I think, should be clear-cut running back 1. He's much better than Isaiah Bowser. I think the only hesitation, he's a little on the smaller side, 5'8", 195 pounds maybe. So he's not that big bruiser, 220 pounds that we've seen in the past from a Gus Malzahn offense. Quarterback, I think it's a decent discussion point, just because I don't know where you're at on JRP. I know I have more shares of him than you do. I think I know he is best suited in a best ball team draft than a redraft, just because he can score 52 points against Temple, and then he can go out and score 5 points against Navy. So, he scored less than 18 fantasy points in half the games played last year. So
yeah, you see, I refer to him as John Rice Plumlee. I feel like when you refer to him as JRP, you probably have a ton of shares of him. So I think that pretty much answered the question to where we stand on John Rice Plumlee JRP. No, I like him. I agree with you. I think the best ball format is really where you're going to make your money with Plumlee. With that being said, look, the potential and the upside there is just too great. You're not going to necessarily project that 8-point performance against Navy. I mean, look, you're just going to miss in some formats. I think this is a guy that in any format, I think is going to be okay. When I look at UCF going over to the Big 12, there's nothing that really scares me. I mean, look, these guys have played against Cincinnati and Houston every year in that conference. I can't say, looking at this list of defenses, there are many other defenses in the Big 12 that are going to be that much better anyway. But to your point, there is going to be a game or two where he's going to hit the wall and he's going to go for that 44, 40, 37, and then boom, you're going to get the 12. Some of the luck of the draw you'd play in sometimes, probably best suited for best ball formats or in 2 quarterback type formats. And I could see where, it's a little bit more of a dicey situation when you're playing in that single quarterback format. So yeah, it does, another format question, but when we have a player ranked in the top 10 as like we do with John Rice Plumlee, I think you and I feel a lot more comfortable this year that maybe he can avoid that 6 or 7 point disaster.
Hopefully, for all the shares that I have of him. But I think I just speaks to the point that, he's projected so highly with us, but those points, he's going to score a ton of points, right? It's just a matter of knowing or guessing, I suppose, projecting when he's going to
yeah, I mean, look, we say it all the time. We've even mentioned it on some shows. It was the reason why Dorian Thompson-Robinson was such a great pick last year. You mentioned the year before how he just turned out those 25 plus performances on a week-to-week
Jordan
basis.
Travis. Yep.
Yeah, Jordan Travis with Florida State. That's what you're looking for. High-level consistency. You don't necessarily need the 50-point games if they're going to give you those 34-plus games every week, right?
Yep, but JRP will get you those 50 and maybe even 60-point games.
For sure.
So it's enticing.
So look, the last team on the list might have might be the least appealing when it comes to fantasy, and not a lot of names to really talk about, because let's just talk about the change at offensive coordinator, where Chad Scott was the West Virginia running backs coach last year. He gets promoted to offensive coordinator, which is probably really nice if you're holding on to CJ Donaldson running back or really targeting him in drafts. For me, when I look at that West Virginia offense, it's CJ Donaldson and 0 of everybody else. Agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I still like Garrett Green as a quarterback, but you just run the risk of this team being absolutely terrible. Neil Brown gets fired. They have a really tough non-conference schedule, and then they have a redshirt freshman in Nico Miracle. They have a backup redshirt freshman, that a 4-star prospect that they really like. So, if they start slow, maybe the coaching staff just is ready to get him in under center. So it's really CJ Donaldson or bust for me. And again, it's really tough for me here with CJ Donaldson, because they could be terrible right out of the gate, and they're not going to be running the ball, right? They're playing from behind. But if they're decent to good, Neil Brown and this offensive staff have shown that they will absolutely hammer their running back one, to the point where he's getting 50% volume share in that backfield, which is it's better than a Steve Sarkisian running back in terms of volume, right? So that's the tough dynamic when it comes to CJ Donaldson. If West Virginia is decent, and it could really hit with CJ Donaldson, and this is a player that he had offers for bags, right, from other P5 teams, yet he chose to stay with West Virginia. So I think that kind of speaks volumes too. So I wouldn't be surprised if they absolutely just hammer CJ Donaldson with carries each week. So a boomer bust type
Yeah, and
prospect.
to your point, when you're looking at the schedule at Penn State, Duquesne at home, and Pitt, right? So 2 of those first 3 aren't exactly easy. Texas Tech at TCU, they're off at Houston, Oklahoma State, UCF, BYU. Like, yeah, I can see where there's some hurdles in the road right there, particularly for this offense if they're not really clicking on all cylinders. But to your point, the longer they stay, the deeper they can stay in games, the better it is for CJ Donaldson. And where we were just talking about John Rice Plumlee, maybe that's where CJ Donaldson ends up too, right? You're going to maybe get some of those 30+ games, but you might be prepared. You better be prepared mentally to kind of have some of those games where if West Virginia's out of it, maybe not so much, right?
You run the risk when you pick CJ Donaldson. So
any other names worth mentioning on this West Virginia roster for you other than the 2 that you just mentioned, Garrett Green and running back CJ Donaldson?
Nope. Let's close it out.
Either for me. Look, man, this was probably one of the longer shows, but man, a lot to talk about, a lot of names there and a lot of good info to get to. So look, let's not belabor the point here. Although, look, this is the first show I think you've done without a hat on. I think.
Yeah.
Is it the first show we've had this year without a hat?
Yeah, we went to the lakes yesterday, so we had to be clean shaven here.
Yeah, well, look, you got the tan and everything working, man. So that, you lost the hat. I love it. Okay. I something looked different. I didn't know if you moved the bottle or the flowers in the background. Yeah. It was the hat the whole time.
Yeah. Hopefully you could deal with the shine off my forehead for this show.
All good, brother. Hey, look, guys, that's going to do it for this show in the preseason preview series for the Big 12. I hope you enjoyed it. Next time you see Mike and I, we're going to be talking Big 10. So, for my partner, Mike Bainbridge, my name is Joe DeSalvo. We'll see you guys when we're talking Big 10. See ya.